Liam rolled into the city like he owned the place, and honestly, he pretty much did. His sleek black Rolls-Royce glided down the busy streets, barely making a sound compared to the rumbling taxis and old sedans coughing out exhaust around him. If you got up close, you'd catch the faint hum of the engine and a glimpse of that trademark double R on the hood, shining like some kind of badge for the elite. Liam leaned back in the plush leather seat, tapping his foot against the floor in time with the subtle jazz playing through the custom sound system. He just adjusted the cuffs of his custom Armani suit, an elegant, charcoal gray number with clean lines and a cut that didn't just fit his body but seemed to hug it. Everything about him screamed money, from the shine on his black leather shoes to the glint of his Rolex, which he'd occasionally glance at like he was daring time itself to try and outrun him. He hadn't always been this confident, but you couldn't tell by looking at him now. Dressed to the nines, he radiated a certain smugness that was hard to ignore. People on the sidewalks watched as he passed, some with envy, some with curiosity, but most just went on with their day. Liam preferred it that way. He wanted to be noticed but not swarmed. After all, blending in was for ordinary folks, and he had no interest in that. He'd been taught that life's a race, and if you're not in the lead, you're losing. The city's neon signs reflected off the polished exterior of his Rolls. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just cruising around, feeling that surge of pride whenever he caught a glimpse of himself in the side mirror. There was something addictive about knowing he had money in the bank, a future carved out by his own ambition, and a world that seemed ready to bow at his feet. He was sure nothing could shake him, not the honking horns, not the bustle of pedestrians, and certainly not the chilly wind that rattled through the city's concrete canyons. Little did he know, fate had a twist planned that would rock him to his very core. As Liam maneuvered the Rolls-Royce around a crowded corner, he spotted a hunched figure on the sidewalk, someone who looked painfully out of place among the gleaming storefronts and well-dressed crowds. Usually he'd speed right by, but there was something about this woman that made him hit the brakes. Her hair was a mix of silver and auburn, tangled and wild, like it had stories to tell. She was staring off into the distance, those dulled green eyes seeming to look at something a million miles away. Liam felt a strange pang in his chest, which was weird because, in his mind, he didn't do pity. It wasn't his style. Still, something about her was different. He pulled up closer, letting the engine idle while he sized up the situation. Pedestrians gave him dirty looks for blocking the way, but he didn't care. Leaning out the window, he tried to get a better look at this frail woman. Her cheeks were hollow, her clothing ragged, and yet there was a kind of elegance in how she held herself. She wasn't panhandling or crying, she was just existing, like someone who'd seen all the city lights and now found them meaningless. Liam considered tossing her a few bills. He had plenty of hundreds to spare, maybe get her a coffee or something. But the longer he stared, the more his usual arrogance kicked in. For a brief moment, he felt uneasy, almost vulnerable, though he couldn't say why. Shaking it off, he pressed the button to roll down the tinted window and let the city's cold night air seep inside. She turned her head, meeting his gaze. Their eyes locked, and for the first time in a long time, Liam's confidence wavered. A current of recognition seemed to pass between them, even though he'd never seen her before. And in that split second, he felt his carefully crafted sense of superiority begin to crack, hinting at the seismic shift that was about to hit his life. Liam hated that she made him feel something. He was all about control, after all. So, instead of giving in to this unexpected wave of compassion, he did what came naturally. He shut it down. With a dismissive sneer, he reached for his wallet, plucked out a crisp $100 bill, and then, in a deliberate show of cruelty, tore it clean in half. The sound of ripping currency seemed louder than the city noise, like it echoed down the street. He tossed both ragged halves at her feet, an arrogant smirk twisting his lips. The shocked gasps of passers-by barely registered in his mind. He was too busy relishing this moment of power, showing the world that he did what he wanted when he wanted. He half expected her to scramble for the torn bill, to snatch up the scraps of paper that might buy a meal or a warm place for the night. But the woman just stared at him, her eyes carrying this odd mix of sorrow and amusement. It was like she was looking straight through him, peering into the dark corners of his being. The discomfort crept back into his gut, more intense this time. He tried to drown it out by focusing on the roar of an approaching bus, the murmur of the crowd, or the hum of his Rolls engine. Anything to distract him from the unsettling tension building between them. He told himself she was just a random homeless woman, maybe crazy, maybe addicted, maybe both. Yet something nagged at his mind. This scene felt almost staged, like a piece of a puzzle he didn't realize he was part of. Shaking off the weirdness, he revved the engine and prepared to speed off, leaving her behind as just another memory he'd file away under people who don't matter. But deep down, a tiny seed of doubt had been planted, a seed that would soon grow into something he'd never have anticipated. Just as Liam's foot pressed the accelerator, he heard it, a soft, breathy chuckle that cut through the noise like a blade. It wasn't hysterical or mocking, just a low, weary laugh that tugged at something buried in his chest. He froze, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. That laugh was oddly familiar, like a distant melody you can't quite place but know you've heard before. For a moment, he considered ignoring it and driving away. It wasn't his problem, right? Still, he glanced back through the open window. The woman was smiling now, a small, sad curve of her lips that made him think she'd seen him at his worst, even if that didn't make any sense. There was a knowingness in her expression, like she was in on a secret that he wasn't. He couldn't stand being out of the loop, especially when it came to something about himself. He lowered the window further. "What's so funny?" he asked, though his tone was more brittle than he intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward, letting the streetlight illuminate her gaunt features. For a split second, Liam swore he saw a flicker in her eyes, a spark of something that reminded him of a face he hadn't thought about in years. The memory was so quick it was almost painful, like the pang you get when you smell a familiar perfume that instantly reminds you of someone you lost. She kept chuckling softly, but there was no mockery in it, just a quiet, resigned acceptance that sent a chill down his spine. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as if trying to warn him that he was stepping into dangerous territory. He shrugged it off, determined to keep his composure. But that unnerving laugh lingered in his mind like an echo he couldn't shut out. And right then he had a gut feeling that whatever was happening here wouldn't be so easy to walk away from this time. Before Liam could collect himself, the woman lifted a trembling hand to her neck. A thin chain dangled there, catching a stray beam of light. Liam thought maybe she was about to beg for money again or show some cheap trinket for sympathy, but what she revealed stopped him cold. Nestled against her collarbone was a small gold locket, delicate and worn. His stomach dropped when he recognized it. He'd once given that exact locket to Evelyn, his late fiancée, on a sunny afternoon that felt like a lifetime ago. He'd picked it out himself, something classy but not too flashy, wanting to show Evelyn how serious he was about their future. Back then, he'd been a slightly different man, a little kinder, maybe more open-hearted. Seeing that locket now felt like a punch to the gut. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Evelyn was gone. That locket should have been buried with her or lost forever in the wreck of that tragic night. He stared, jaw slack, as the woman cradled the locket like it was her most precious possession. His mind spun with 100 questions. How did she get it? Was she some con artist who'd rummaged through an estate sale? The city had its fair share of hustlers, but something about her felt genuine. Like she wasn't trying to fool him, but was simply showing him something that was his, yet not his anymore. Anger mixed with confusion as he demanded, "Where'd you get that?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying him, and he hated that vulnerability. The woman held his gaze, her eyes reflecting a world of pain. She didn't answer with words, just gently opened the locket, revealing an old photograph inside. Evelyn's smiling face, forever preserved at a moment in time when life still felt hopeful. Liam's heart thundered so loud, he was sure she could hear it. He knew right then that this was more than a strange encounter on a cold sidewalk. This was the start of something far bigger, something that would dig into the deepest parts of him he'd tried so hard to bury. It would have been easier if she'd just been a stranger. Someone Liam could drop a few bills on and never think about again. But the way she tilted her head, the subtle curve of her jawline, and the haunted green in her eyes made his blood run cold. He blinked hard, telling himself he was just imagining things. But the resemblance was undeniable. Something about her face screamed Evelyn, like a faded memory brought to life. She said nothing, only offered him a sad, knowing smile that seemed to say, "I understand what you're thinking." Liam tried to snap out of it. He let out a scoff, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I don't know who you think you are," he muttered, his tone as cool as he could manage. "But you'd better explain how you got that locket." The woman's eyes flickered with emotion. Pain, regret, maybe even affection. It was too overwhelming to dissect. She finally spoke, her voice raspy like she'd been silent for far too long. "You gave it to me, Liam. Once, long ago." Each word felt like a clue to a puzzle that shouldn't exist. A cold sweat broke out along his hairline, and the city's sounds seemed to fade into the background. In that moment, the only thing he could hear was the frantic beat of his own heart. He swallowed hard, refusing to accept the impossible. "Evelyn's gone," he insisted, his voice trembling on the edge of anger. "She died. I was there." It was true. He'd seen the aftermath, the shattered glass, the mangled car, and then the funeral he hadn't bothered to stick around for. Yet here he was, face to face with someone who looked like a ghost wearing his fiancée's jewelry. As the city's cold wind whipped through the open car window, Liam realized nothing in his privileged life had prepared him for the chilling, unexplainable possibility that Evelyn, or some echo of her, had returned. Back at his penthouse that night, Liam couldn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw that woman's face, and each time, it morphed into Evelyn's, bright and alive. He kept replaying their final moments together, no matter how hard he tried to push the memories away. It was like a reel of regrets looping in his head, fueled by guilt he'd never fully acknowledged. He saw the fight they'd had that night, the harsh words, her desperate pleas for him to slow down, to reconsider his choices. She'd been wearing a light blue dress he'd once admired, but the color had blurred in his memory over time, replaced by the red haze of anger and the neon glare of a night out gone wrong. He'd been so sure of his own righteousness back then, so consumed by pride that he couldn't see how badly he was hurting her. In the dreamlike recollection, Evelyn's voice rose in heartbreak rather than fury. She tried to tell him she was scared of his reckless driving, his need to show off, and the ego that seemed to swell by the day. But Liam wouldn't listen. He'd snatched the car keys, revved the engine, and left her standing there. She had no choice but to climb in if she wanted to stay by his side. That was the woman Evelyn was, loyal to a fault, willing to follow him even if it meant risking everything. He remembered the chill in the air that night, how his hands gripped the wheel too tight, how the city lights blurred as he pushed the accelerator. The bitter argument kept replaying, overshadowing the music blaring on the radio. Then came the screech of tires, someone else's, not his, followed by the sickening crunch of metal on metal. He saw the horror in Evelyn's eyes just before darkness swallowed the world. He told himself over and over that he wasn't to blame, that life was just cruel. But deep in his heart he knew the truth: he could have saved her. Instead, he'd walked away, letting fate seal the deal he'd unwittingly set in motion. That horrific night was etched in Liam's mind with razor-sharp clarity, no matter how many times he pretended it was just a blur. They'd been speeding along a wet road, the rain pounding against the windshield in a furious torrent. It was late, maybe too late for anyone sane to be driving at those speeds, but Liam's adrenaline was in overdrive. Evelyn's voice had turned frantic, begging him to slow down, her nails digging into the passenger seat. He still heard the pitch of her scream, caught between terror and desperation. Then came a sudden flash of headlights from the oncoming lane, the honk of a horn that didn't stand a chance to prevent what was about to happen. The impact was deafening. Metal crumpled like paper and shattered glass sprayed everywhere. In the chaos, Liam's head slammed against the steering wheel, and for a split second all went quiet, like the world had hit the mute button. When he finally came to, the car was sideways in the middle of the intersection. The other vehicle was overturned, steam hissing from its hood. Evelyn was slumped against the door, her breath shallow and her skin pale. He remembered unfastening his seatbelt with shaking hands, ignoring the blood trickling down his forehead. Panic shot through him like electricity. He tried to open her door, but it was stuck. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He called her name, but she didn't respond. The sirens seemed far away, like some distant soundtrack in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. In the haze of it all, he caught a glimpse of something in Evelyn's hand. A slender chain that glinted when the emergency lights finally found them. It was the locket, lying on her lap, the clasp broken. She'd worn it that night, against his wishes. He'd told her to keep it somewhere safe, but she'd insisted on having it close. He remembered thinking, what a foolish little trinket. But in that instant, it wasn't foolish at all. It was a reminder of everything they were about to lose. When the medics finally swarmed the scene, Liam stumbled out of the car. He was still conscious, still able to walk, while Evelyn couldn't even open her eyes. The guilt washed over him that night, though he'd spent years burying it. Now it was rising back up with a vengeance he never saw coming. Days after the crash, when Evelyn's body was found lifeless in the hospital bed, Liam went numb. He went through the motions, arranging the funeral, dealing with the aftermath, but never truly letting the loss sink in. It was easier to blame fate, to chalk it all up to a tragic accident. He told himself over and over that he couldn't have done anything more, that the collision was out of his control, that the universe just dealt him a bad hand. But late at night, in the solitude of his penthouse, he'd feel the cracks in his facade. He'd remember the flicker of terror in her eyes as he'd pressed the gas pedal down. He'd recall how she'd pleaded for him to be careful, how he'd shrugged off her worries with cold arrogance, and that memory alone would sit like a stone in his chest. He'd bury it beneath work, luxury, and the steady accumulation of wealth. Whenever it started to resurface, he'd find a new distraction, an investment, a high-stakes deal, or a lavish party. Now, that carefully crafted sense of denial was unraveling. The homeless woman with the green eyes and silver-streaked auburn hair was a living reminder that he'd left something undone, something unresolved. He paced around his penthouse, the skyline twinkling outside his floor-to-ceiling windows. The city's lights used to make him feel like the king of the world. Tonight, they made him feel trapped, as if every reflection in those glass panes was judging him. A restlessness clawed at him. For the first time in a long while, he couldn't sleep off the guilt. No amount of whiskey or expensive cigars seemed to numb it. The more he tried to resist, the stronger it hit him. He'd turned into the very person Evelyn had feared he'd become. Cold, self-centered, and capable of hurting others without remorse. And now, with that strangely familiar stranger appearing like a ghost from his past, he had an eerie sense that this was only the beginning of the price he'd have to pay. Each night became a battleground for Liam. The nightmares were relentless, assaulting his sleep with twisted scenes of that fatal crash. In his dreams, the asphalt shimmered like a dark river, and the city lights bled into blurry streaks as if time itself was melting. He'd hear the screech of tires, louder than in reality, and then he'd see Evelyn, dressed in that same blue dress, standing in the middle of the road. She'd turn to face him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and accusation, and he'd feel rooted to the spot, unable to save her. Sometimes the dream would shift to a symbolic nightmare. He'd be running through endless corridors of shattered glass, each reflective shard showing Evelyn's face, or sometimes his own, twisted in guilt. Other nights he'd find himself trapped in a sinking Rolls-Royce, water rushing in, with Evelyn's distant voice echoing around him, asking why he'd left her. Every single time he'd jolt awake drenched in sweat, his heart hammering like it was trying to break free from his ribcage. During the day, shadows seemed to dance at the edges of his vision, making him second-guess his surroundings. The reflection in store windows would sometimes show Evelyn standing next to him, only for him to blink and realize it was just his mind playing tricks. He'd pass by a random alley and swear he heard her voice carried on the wind. It wasn't just his imagination running wild, it felt like these visions or illusions had a real weight, a presence, as if something was actively trying to torment him. His staff noticed changes, too. His personal driver mentioned how quiet he'd become. His assistant noted that he canceled meetings more often, locking himself away in his office. But nobody dared confront him about it. Liam was known for his temper, especially when stressed. He tried to maintain his cool exterior, but the cracks were showing. Something supernatural was creeping in, dissolving that veneer of control he'd so carefully maintained. And the scariest part was, a growing part of him believed he deserved every ounce of this torment. Liam's high-rise penthouse used to feel like a fortress, a place where problems stayed outside, locked. Inside felt downright eerie. Lights flickered without explanation, and sometimes an ice-cold draft would snake through the living room, even though the heating system was top-notch. Late at night, he'd hear faint whispers echoing through the hallways, like soft conversations he couldn't quite make out. They made his hair stand on end. He tried telling himself it was just the building settling, or maybe the hum of the ventilation system. But deep down, he sensed a presence. Occasionally, he'd catch a glimpse of a silhouette in his peripheral vision, only to turn and see nothing. Other times, he'd swear he felt a hand brush against his shoulder when no one was there. It was more than just paranoia. It was as if the penthouse had become a conduit for forces he didn't understand. The worst was when the whispers started calling his name. It happened late one night while he was pouring himself a drink. He froze mid-pour, nearly dropping the expensive bottle of scotch as he heard a voice, a gentle murmur that sounded disturbingly like Evelyn. It whispered, "Liam," so softly he thought he might be dreaming. But he was wide awake, and the sense of dread that seized him was all too real. He spent hours scouring the internet, searching for logical explanations. He looked up stories about faulty wiring, illusions caused by stress, even carbon monoxide leaks causing hallucinations. But deep down, he felt something else at play, something not of this world. The memory of that homeless woman, who seemed to share Evelyn's face, kept surfacing. It was like her presence had unlocked a doorway that let in these ghostly manifestations. And for the first time, Liam found himself truly scared, because money, power, and status offered no defense against this kind of haunting. Liam finally admitted to himself that something supernatural was happening. He wasn't a superstitious man, nor had he ever paid attention to ghost stories or urban legends. Yet the evidence was getting hard to ignore. From the eerie drafts to those whispering voices, it felt like he was living in a horror movie he couldn't turn off. Strangely, though, every incident seemed tied back to Evelyn. Her locket, her laugh, the sense of her presence hovering just beyond his line of sight. He began to suspect that his cruel actions, both past and present, had triggered some otherworldly reprisal. The woman on the sidewalk, who might be Evelyn or something embodying her spirit, acted like a catalyst, setting off a chain of events that he could neither stop nor fully understand. He thought about that torn $100 bill, how vicious and spiteful he'd been, and he started to realize this was bigger than just guilt. It was like the universe, or something in it, had decided to give him a very personal kind of punishment. Oddly enough, a part of him felt he deserved it. He'd walked away from Evelyn's crash, and then he'd gone on to become even colder, more arrogant, caring about no one but himself. If she truly was back, spiritually or otherwise, he couldn't blame her for wanting retribution. The thought of facing her wrath terrified him, but a deeper, more hidden part of him almost welcomed it, as if he needed some cosmic justice to settle the debt he owed. Late at night, he'd stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city lights. In those moments, he felt impossibly small and powerless. The curse, if that's what it was, had only just begun. He could sense it in the electric charge that seemed to cling to the air. It whispered to him that he couldn't run from this. He might be able to bribe his way out of legal trouble or talk circles around a hostile takeover, but this? There was no amount of money that could silence a ghost determined to make him pay. Desperation has a funny way of humbling a person. Liam, who'd once scoffed at anything outside his logical, finance-driven worldview, found himself reading books on the occult late into the night. He'd slip into strange little bookstores in the city's older districts, hunting for any scrap of information that might explain what was happening. He devoured myths, legends, and even old wives' tales, piecing together bits of knowledge like a detective trying to solve his own haunting. At first, he worried about his reputation. Imagine the gossip if someone spotted him in these dingy shops, flipping through dusty grimoires or tabloids about ghost sightings. But soon enough, he stopped caring. The fear was stronger than his pride, a realization that shook him deeply. He even considered hiring a private investigator, but what good would that do against a spirit or curse? He combed through newspapers from the night of the crash, reread Evelyn's obituary, and even visited the scene of the accident under the cover of darkness, trying to see if there was anything he missed, a clue, a sign, maybe even the fragments of the broken locket. The streets felt colder there, like time had paused in that one spot. He felt her spirit was closer, a sense of her presence lingering in every flicker of the street lamp. Stranger stories began to catch his eye, rumors of cursed objects, accounts of people haunted by loved ones they'd wronged. It all seemed surreal, but it spoke to him in a way he couldn't ignore. He spent nights scribbling notes on everything from ghostly apparitions to demonic possessions, although something told him that calling it demonic might be missing the point. This felt personal, tethered to his conscience and his past. A deep-seated shame followed him like a stray dog he couldn't shake. And no matter how much he learned, the biggest question remained, why was Evelyn or something wearing her face here now? He was almost certain the answer would be as terrifying as the haunting itself. While digging through old family records, Liam stumbled upon revelations that rattled his already frayed nerves. He'd always assumed he came from a line of successful, if not entirely moral, businesspeople. But the papers and journals he discovered painted a darker picture, one filled with shady deals, betrayals, and a pattern of neglect that stretched back generations. His grandfather, it turned out, had swindled dozens of folks during a post-war construction boom, driving many to bankruptcy. His great-uncle had been implicated in a scandal involving stolen inheritances from family members. Everywhere Liam looked, he found evidence of a tradition of cruelty and exploitation, all under the polished veneer of wealth. He'd never bothered to question the money or influence he inherited, he just took it and ran. But now he saw the roots of his own arrogance in a legacy built on other people's ruin. The more he unearthed, the more he sensed a pattern, men in his family climbing to the top by stepping on anyone in their way, friends, family, business partners. And the repercussions didn't stop with financial ruin. There were whispers of suspicious deaths and disappearances in the margins of these stories. Liam couldn't help but wonder if there was some deeper cosmic tally being kept, some force that demanded payback. Evelyn's death might have been the culminating tragedy of generations of wrongdoing. Could that explain her reappearance, or the curse that followed? Was he just another link in a chain of misdeeds that finally snapped? These questions gnawed at him, fueling a sense of dread that grew with every new discovery. He felt like he was uncovering a rotten foundation upon which his entire life was built. And it wasn't just his personal guilt about Evelyn anymore. It was a family legacy, a pattern of darkness that might be inescapable unless he found a way to break free. Yet how do you break free from a destiny that's been mapped out by the sins of your ancestors? Liam didn't have the answer, but he knew he had to try or risk losing what was left of his soul. That evening, the weight of all these revelations pressed down on Liam like a suffocating blanket. He stood on his penthouse balcony, gazing at the city that once symbolized his success but now felt like a prison. His mind spun with memories of Evelyn, the woman on the sidewalk, and the family skeletons he'd unearthed. He couldn't recall the last time he'd felt truly at peace, and the realization stung like a fresh wound. He lit a cigarette, something he rarely did, just to have something to focus on besides his own spiraling thoughts. The glowing ember offered a fleeting comfort, a distraction from the churning guilt in his gut. Despite the cool night air, sweat beaded on his forehead. He thought about calling an old friend or maybe his lawyer, someone who could talk him off the ledge of the psychological freefall. But the phone felt heavy in his hand, and the idea of explaining the haunting didn't even seem possible. Who would believe him? Turning away from the city lights, he saw his reflection in the glass doors leading back inside. In it he looked haunted, hollow, even older, somehow. For the first time he let himself truly question what he'd become, a man so consumed by vanity and wealth that he could overlook the most precious thing he'd ever had. Evelyn had been his anchor, the one who saw through his bravado and loved him anyway. And how had he repaid that love? By giving in to his worst impulses, by discarding her at the very moment she needed him most. Tears prickled the corners of his eyes, surprising him. Liam Devlin wasn't a man who cried. He was the strong one, the winner, the guy who always came out on top. But here he stood, alone, with the smell of smoke curling around him and regret pushing him to his knees, figuratively if not literally. He knew he couldn't keep living like this. The shadows of his past were everywhere, and they weren't just ghosts, they were a relentless reminder that he'd been the architect of his own downfall. A few nights later, Liam found himself standing outside a dusty archive located in the basement of a city library. Surrounded by towering shelves of old records and the musty smell of aged paper, he flipped through files with trembling fingers. He was following a lead he'd stumbled upon in one of those peculiar occult books, a reference to a curse said to befall those who'd forsaken true love under violent circumstances. It sounded outlandish, but he was past caring. Any thread of hope, however thin, felt worth tugging. That's when he made a startling discovery. Tucked away in an old newspaper clipping was a reference to a young woman who'd survived a car crash in circumstances disturbingly similar to Evelyn's. The article hinted that her survival wasn't due to medical miracles alone, but rather something unnatural. Witnesses claimed they saw her wandering the streets, disoriented, long after she was declared dead by paramedics. Liam's heart thundered in his chest as he read the details, how she carried a trinket that supposedly bound her soul to a vow of vengeance. The parallels were too close to ignore. Could Evelyn have survived in some twisted manner, sustained by sheer fury at his betrayal? Or maybe her spirit refused to rest, finding a way to manifest in a frail body driven by a mission to make him pay. He tried to brush off the idea as a fairy tale, but the pieces were coming together too neatly. The woman with the silver-streaked hair and green eyes could be the living embodiment of that curse, forged from heartbreak and anger. He left the library with a renewed sense of dread. Nothing felt random anymore, not the nightmares, not the ghostly whispers, not the curse that seemed to grip him tighter every day. It was all building to something, an endgame he could almost taste in the air, bitter and cold. As he made his way home through the dimly lit streets, he felt the weight of a destiny he never asked for but had helped create. The truth was unraveling before him, and it was terrifying in its clarity. Whatever was haunting him was intimately tied to that night, and there might be no escaping its final judgment. As the days wore on, Liam's once glamorous life began to erode. Rumors circulated in his corporate circles that he was losing his edge. His typically sharp suits hung a bit looser, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He canceled meetings, missing out on deals he would have once pounced on. Overnight, it felt like the world he'd built was crumbling around him. No hostile takeover needed. It was a one-man collapse, orchestrated by the ghosts of his past. Worse still, he started experiencing odd physical ailments. Sudden fevers, piercing headaches, and a persistent ache in his chest. Doctors found nothing medically wrong, attributing it to stress and exhaustion. But he knew something else was at play. It was like each pang in his body was a reminder of the life he'd taken for granted, and the life he'd robbed from Evelyn. He'd wake up gasping for breath at night, clutching at the space where she should have been. The emptiness gnawed at him, fueling his paranoia. His employees whispered that he'd gone mad or was dabbling in dark things. Normally, he'd squash such gossip, but he couldn't muster the energy. Instead, he'd lock himself in his office, scrolling through old pictures of Evelyn, replaying the sound of her laughter in his head, and bracing for the next ghostly encounter. He could almost sense her spirit swirling around him, growing stronger with each passing day. If guilt was a currency, he was paying interest at an astronomical rate. Financial losses followed. Stocks in his company dipped sharply. Deals he'd been certain would finalize fell through. It was as if the curse extended beyond his personal life, seeping into his business dealings. His name, once a byword for success, started sounding like a cautionary tale around the boardroom. But the worst blow wasn't monetary. It was the creeping realization that all his power meant nothing. He couldn't bribe a ghost. He couldn't negotiate with a curse. And it was that helplessness, more than anything, that finally shattered the last of his arrogance. Liam's spiral into madness was both gradual and abrupt, like watching a car crash in slow motion but feeling every jarring impact. Night after night, sleep turned into a torture chamber of vicious nightmares. Each morning, he woke up feeling more drained, more defeated, like a piece of himself had been lost in the realm of shadows. He started avoiding mirrors, convinced he'd see Evelyn's face staring back at him or the reflection of something sinister lurking behind. His once pristine penthouse looked disheveled. Half-empty coffee cups littered marble countertops. Documents were strewn across the floor, and the windows, usually gleaming, were smeared with dust. He'd lost the will to keep up appearances. Even his prized Rolls-Royce sat unused in the parking garage, gathering a thin layer of grime that matched the tarnish on his soul. The ghostly encounters escalated. Sometimes he'd see Evelyn, her figure flickering at the end of a hallway, eyes brimming with sorrow. Other times, objects would move inexplicably, like the pen rolling off his desk without any slope to blame. And then there were the voices, disembodied whispers that grew louder until they became almost deafening. They tormented him with accusations, calling him a coward, a betrayer, a murderer. In weaker moments, he responded, shouting back at the apparitions, begging them to leave him alone or cursing them for their cruelty. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, Liam clawed his way out of bed and stumbled to the living room where he saw her, Evelyn, or something that looked like her. She was seated on the plush couch wearing that old blue dress, her eyes shining with tears. He froze, hands trembling. He wanted to run to her, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But the moment he took a step, she vanished into thin air, leaving only the echo of his labored breathing. That was the night he realized he wasn't just being haunted, he was being broken down piece by piece, forced to confront every horrible thing he'd done. And the more he resisted, the deeper he sank into the quicksand of his own remorse. Word got around that Liam was acting strangely, and soon the city seemed caught in a weird ripple effect. Reports of unexplainable phenomena popped up in places Liam frequented. A doorman at a luxury hotel claimed he heard footsteps in an empty corridor. A street vendor swore he saw a hazy figure pass right through a parked car. People whispered about a chill settling in certain corners of the city, as if the temperature dropped whenever Liam walked by. It was like his personal haunting was bleeding into the wider world. Everywhere he turned, there were reminders of his past cruelty. Strangers he'd scammed in business deals seemed to appear out of nowhere, scowling at him from across the street. Old acquaintances who'd grown distant recounted tales of how Liam's ruthless ambition had left them bruised. It was as though the city itself was turning against him, raising its own chorus of ghosts and grudges. He couldn't hide from it. Even his attempts to stay in seclusion backfired. The more he locked himself away, the louder the city's supernatural hum became. At the same time, rumors surfaced about other hauntings. Some folks claimed their apartments were filled with flickering lights and phantom knocks. Others mentioned seeing silhouettes in alleyways that vanished when approached. The local news ran a segment on the City of Apparitions featuring grainy cell phone footage of glowing orbs and shadowy figures. A part of Liam knew he was at the center of it all, like some cursed anchor pulling the spiritual realm closer to the mundane world. He'd always believed the city was his playground, a place to conquer and control. Now it felt like a haunted labyrinth he couldn't escape. The buildings, once symbols of his power, loomed ominously, their windows like eyes watching his every move. He wondered how many more ghosts would be unleashed because of him. Was there a limit to the damage his guilt could cause, or would the entire city become a stage for the restless dead? As the days went on, he started to fear the answer was darker than he could fathom. Late one stormy night, Liam finally gathered the courage to confront the locket head-on. He'd stashed it in a velvet-lined drawer, too terrified to look at it since that uncanny encounter with the homeless woman. But something in his gut told him the locket was key to understanding, or at least facing, whatever horror had taken over his life. The power went out right as he reached for the drawer, plunging the penthouse into darkness, save for the erratic flashes of lightning outside. With shaky hands, he used the light of his phone to fish out the tiny gold trinket. There it was, gleaming softly despite the surrounding gloom, like it had its own inner light. A wave of memories crashed over him, Evelyn laughing on a sunny day, the way she'd hold his hand, the warmth in her eyes. All the good times they'd shared before his ego and ambition swallowed them whole. Then came the darker memories. The locket had still hung around her neck the night she died, or so he'd thought. But somehow it had survived, only to resurface with a woman who might be Evelyn reborn or something far more sinister wearing her face. Either way, the locket felt like the center of the curse, pulsing with an energy he couldn't fully comprehend. He held it by the chain, and in the lightning flashes, he thought he saw shadows swirl around it, forming fleeting shapes that resembled faces contorted in agony. He tried to open it, but the clasp was stuck, like it had fused shut. His heart pounded as he fumbled with it, finally prying it open with a small screwdriver. Inside, as before, was the tiny photo of Evelyn SM. Shook the building, and for a moment, Liam thought he heard Evelyn's voice again, whispering his name in the dark. The sensation was so overwhelming, he dropped the locket. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent apartment. He knelt to pick it up, breath catching in his throat. He realized the locket wasn't just a keepsake, it was a beacon for the vengeful spirit, a symbol of their bond and the betrayal that ruined it. Breaking its hold would mean facing the past in a way he never had before. And the mere thought of that confrontation sent a shiver through his soul. The next morning, Liam sat at the old mahogany desk in his late father's study. He'd avoided this room for years, unsettled by the austere portraits lining the walls, stern faces of Devlins stretching back generations. In the daylight, the stern eyes of his ancestors seemed to follow him, accusing him of weakness. Yet he sensed he wasn't the only one carrying guilt in this room. He pulled out a leather-bound journal he'd found among his father's belongings. Inside were cryptic entries hinting at some dark burden passed down through the family. References to curses, broken promises, and something called the Watchers peppered the pages. It was unnerving, to say the least. The Devlin men had apparently known of some persistent malevolence trailing them, a force spurred by their collective misdeeds. Perhaps each generation thought they could outwit it through money or power, only to fall prey to its grip in the end. As he read on, he found a passage describing a ritual meant to quell the spirit of the wronged. It involved an act of contrition, some sort of public admission of guilt, sealed with a meaningful offering. But it was vague and the instructions seemed incomplete. There was a note scribbled in the margin, "The locket is key." Liam felt a chill reading that. It confirmed what he'd suspected. This curse, this haunting, had likely been building momentum for centuries, but Evelyn's death was the final trigger. Now he understood why his father and grandfather had been so guarded, always looking over their shoulders. They'd sensed something was amiss but never had the spine to face it outright. And in ignoring it, they'd let the burden grow. Liam realized he might be the last chance to break the cycle. But was he ready to do what it would take? The mere idea of baring his soul, admitting his faults for everyone to see, filled him with dread. Yet, if he ran from this, there'd be no end to the torment for him or for whatever was left of Evelyn in this twisted netherworld. After poring over the journal and other dusty tomes, Liam knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who'd faced similar curses or at least believed in the possibility of them. That's how he ended up sitting in a dimly lit cafe across from a small group of strangers he'd found through an underground forum dedicated to the supernatural. It felt surreal, like he'd stepped into some modern-day version of a ghost story club. Each of them had tales of weird experiences. A middle-aged man claimed his grandmother's ghost followed him around, rearranging furniture in the night. A young woman with tired eyes described seeing the apparition of her abusive stepfather at every major life event, no matter where she moved. They might have sounded insane to anyone else, but to Liam, they were the first people who didn't dismiss his story. They listened as he recounted the nightmares, the sightings, and the cursed locket, nodding with understanding rather than disbelief. This ragtag group had spent years collecting knowledge on haunted artifacts, ancient rituals, and exorcisms. They shared tips on protective amulets, cleansing prayers, and the importance of remorse in lifting a curse. Liam felt a sliver of relief, like maybe there was a path to redemption. But the cost was steep. It required genuine repentance, the sort he'd never really done. Apologies in his world were half-hearted and transactional. This demanded something real, and that scared him more than facing another ghostly encounter. He left the cafe with a list of contacts, a paranormal researcher, an old priest, and a historian specializing in ancestral curses. He also carried a sense of cautious hope. For the first time in a while, Liam believed there might be a way out of this waking nightmare. But it wouldn't be simple. It involved facing his own darkness, admitting he'd been wrong, and perhaps even relinquishing some of the luxuries he'd always considered essential to his identity. Redemption, he realized, was like a fragile flame. You had to protect it and feed it with honesty, or it'd flicker out before it ever had a chance to warm your soul. Desperation drove Liam to the doorstep of a man who called himself Maven, a recluse rumored to have studied arcane knowledge for decades. His place was as off-putting as expected: dark drapes, cluttered bookshelves, and a faint smell of incense mixed with something metallic. Maven was thin, with piercing eyes and a voice that seemed to echo even in a quiet room. Liam explained his situation, half expecting to be thrown out or laughed at. But Maven listened intently, nodding as if he'd heard it all before. Then he offered a proposition. A pact that might, just might, break the curse, but only if Liam was willing to sacrifice a piece of himself. The specifics were murky, involving an offering of blood, the locket, and a written confession of guilt. Maven warned it was risky. If Liam's remorse wasn't genuine, the ritual could backfire, strengthening the curse instead of lifting it. Despite every logical cell in his body screaming at him to leave, Liam found himself nodding in agreement. He was at the end of his rope. Haunted day and night, business in shambles, family secrets unraveling. If there was even a slim chance to end this torment, he'd take it. Maven scribbled down a list of items needed. Candles of certain colors, a chalice, a ring of salt, and a location that had significance to the tragedy. The mention of Evelyn's crash site sent a jolt through Liam, but he realized that's exactly where he needed to be. The cost was steep. Maven demanded an exorbitant fee, as well as Liam's vow that he'd commit fully to the ritual. Liam handed over the money without hesitation. For a man who used to pride himself on rationality, he was plunging headfirst into the unknown, guided by fear and a flicker of hope. As he left Maven's eerie home, he clutched the instructions tightly. His mind reeled with the enormity of what he'd just agreed to. A piece of him wondered if he was making a deal with the devil. But as the shadows of Evelyn's memory pressed in, he realized the real devil was in his own conscience, and he'd do whatever it took to be free of it. Armed with Maven's instructions, Liam prepared for the showdown he sensed was coming. He spent the next few days gathering the ritual items: thick candles, coarse salt, and a chalice carved with strange symbols. Each purchase felt like a step deeper into a world he never wanted to believe in. Yet here he was, about to walk right into its heart. He barely slept, knowing that soon he'd face Evelyn, if it really was her, and lay bare the guilt he'd kept buried for years. He also worried about the small group of fellow curse sufferers he'd met. They'd encouraged him, but they couldn't fight this battle for him. No one could. It was a confrontation between him and the spirit that wore Evelyn's face. And if he failed, well, he tried not to think about the consequences. On the night of the planned ritual, he drove out to the crash site. The Rolls-Royce felt cold and lonely, the interior lights casting eerie shadows. He recalled how proud he'd been of that car, as if it was a trophy proclaiming his worth. Now he felt almost ashamed of it, a symbol of the arrogance that had led him down this path. The city lights gave way to darker roads where street lamps grew scarce. His heart pounded in rhythm with the hum of the engine, an anxious drumbeat that wouldn't let up. Rain began to fall lightly, pattering against the windshield. It was almost like the sky was weeping for what was about to happen. Liam clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he turned onto the deserted stretch of road. He spotted the remnants of skid marks near the intersection, faded by time but still visible under the weak glow of a single street lamp. Pulling over, he killed the engine and sat in silence, the sound of rain filling his ears. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm unleashes its fury. Taking a shaky breath, he stepped out into the damp night. It was time to confront the ghost of Evelyn and possibly the darkest parts of himself. Following Maven's instructions, Liam left the crash site and headed to an abandoned luxury hotel on the outskirts of the city. The building loomed against the dark sky, once grand but now eerily silent, its windows broken, its facade covered in graffiti. According to legend, this place had its own haunted history, perfect for amplifying the ritual's power. Liam felt a chill crawl up his spine as he approached the massive, boarded-up entrance. A broken neon sign flickered a ghostly welcome as if mocking him. Prying open a side door, he ventured into the lobby, which was lit only by sporadic flashes of lightning through shattered skylights. The floor was littered with debris, and the echo of his footsteps sounded like faint whispers. Every so often he swore he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a shape flitting past a doorway or a glimmer of green eyes peering from the shadows. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that fear was part of the process. He had to confront these apparitions with resolve or risk being consumed by them. He found a spacious ballroom that had fared slightly better than the rest of the hotel. The marble floors were cracked, but enough open space remained to set up the ritual circle. With trembling hands, he placed the candles in a precise pattern, sprinkled salt around them, and set the chalice in the center. The locket rested in his pocket, feeling heavier than it ever had before. Lightning illuminated the vast room, briefly revealing ghostly silhouettes along the walls. Liam tried to ignore them, focusing on lighting the candles one by one. Each flame cast long, dancing shadows. The thunder rattled the windows and the air smelled of dust and damp with an undercurrent of something rotten. The atmosphere screamed haunted at every turn. He knelt by the circle, reading from Maven's instructions, voice shaking but determined. His words echoed, bouncing off distant corridors that led deeper into the hotel's abandoned floors. He could feel eyes upon him, and he knew this was it, no turning back. If Evelyn, or whatever spirit had taken her place, was going to appear, it would be here, in the heart of this decaying monument to lost grandeur. Halfway through the ritual incantation, the ballroom's temperature plummeted. Liam's breath puffed out in visible wisps, and the candle flames sputtered. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to flee. Then, in a sudden burst of lightning, she was there, Evelyn's form, standing just beyond the circle of candles. Her blue dress fluttered in an invisible breeze, and those green eyes glistened with an otherworldly glow. A thunderclap shook the room, and the candles nearly extinguished, but their flames held on, flickering wildly. Time seemed to slow as he locked eyes with her. "Evelyn," he whispered, voice cracking with a lifetime's worth of regret. She didn't respond, just looked at him with a mixture of longing and rage. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. Gathering every ounce of courage, he clutched the locket and held it up as if offering it back to her. Tears blurred his vision. I'm sorry," he stammered, voice choking on the words he'd never said when she was alive. "I failed you. I was selfish, arrogant. I loved you, but I let my pride destroy everything." Evelyn's form flickered, her expression twisting between sorrow and wrath. She raised a hand, and Liam felt a crushing weight on his chest, as though unseen hands were forcing him down. Pain shot through his body. He gasped, almost losing consciousness, but he forced himself to speak again. "I'm the one responsible," he admitted. "I should have listened that night, should have cared more about you than my own ego. I was too blind to see what I had until it was gone." For a moment, her face softened and the grip on his chest relaxed. But then came a surge of energy that flung him backward like a ragdoll. He collided with a cracked marble pillar, coughing and wincing in pain. The candles went out and he could see nothing but lightning flashes in the darkness. The wind roared through shattered windows, and he heard her voice, a haunting moan of pain and rage that echoed through every corner of the hotel. This was it, the final reckoning. Whether he survived hinged on whether his apology was sincere enough, whether he could prove he'd changed. Liam crawled back toward the circle, the locket clutched in his trembling hand, praying that he could mend, if not undo, the wrongs that had led them both here. Darkness engulfed the ballroom when the last candle snuffed out. Liam heard the groan of old beams in the ceiling, the howl of wind through shattered windows, and the soft shuffle of something or someone moving closer. His heart hammered so loud he thought it would explode. In a sudden flash of lightning, he saw her again, Evelyn's ghostly form looming above him, eyes shining like emeralds in the gloom. Then everything shifted into a dreamlike haze. Visions assailed him, memories both his and not his. He saw scenes from their life together, quieter moments of shared laughter, the day he first placed the locket around her neck, the night he nearly proposed but got too caught up in a business deal to follow through. Then came the uglier parts, the arguments, the hurtful words, the crash. It was like Evelyn, or whatever remained of her, was showing him all he'd chosen to forget or minimize. And in the swirl of images, he also saw glimpses of her pain after the accident, fleeting shadows of her wandering hospital hallways, a half-life between worlds consumed by betrayal. He was kneeling, drenched in sweat, hardly aware of the cold floor beneath him. Tears streamed down his face as he finally let himself feel the grief he'd buried. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he croaked, raising his voice above the roaring wind. "But if there's any part of you that still sees the man I was before I got so lost, please let me do this right. Let me be better." Evelyn's figure flickered again, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. In a brief stillness, Liam felt a tangible shift in the air. It was as though a heavy weight had been lifted, if only slightly. Lightning illuminated the ballroom one more time, showing her face contorted with sorrow. Then, in a voice that sounded both near and far, she whispered, "It hurts so much." The words sank into Liam's soul. At that moment, all pretense vanished. There was no boardroom swagger, no fortress of wealth, just a shattered man trying to mend what he'd broken, even if it might be too late. He offered the locket with outstretched hands, willing to lay everything bare, desperate for any chance at redemption. The hotel grew unbearably silent, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. Liam's vision blurred, and he struggled to remain upright. Evelyn, or the vengeful spirit that wore her likeness, drew closer. He felt her presence radiate a cold that stabbed at his bones. A fleeting thought crossed his mind, this could be it, the moment I pay the ultimate price. Yet he didn't run. For once he stood his ground. With the locket gripped in his trembling hands, he whispered a final plea. "I'm sorry. I've said it before, but I mean it now more than ever. I'm ready to face whatever you decide I deserve. If it's death, then so be it. But if there's any piece of you that can still love, that can still forgive," his words trailed off, drowned in the weight of what he was asking. A jagged bolt of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating Evelyn's spectral face. Time seemed to freeze as her features contorted, racked by some internal struggle. Then, a soft glow emanated from the locket, as though the tiny picture within had captured a sliver of hope. Liam watched in disbelief as the cold presence ebbed. Where there had been fury, there was now uncertainty, and where there had been pure anguish, a faint warmth flickered, like a dying ember wanting to live again. With a trembling hand, he opened the locket. The photo of Evelyn smiled back, eternally locked in a moment of happiness. "Please," he repeated, voice quivering. "Let this be the end of our suffering. Let me make amends." For a heartbeat, he thought he saw Evelyn's real expression peeking through the ghostly visage, a hint of the woman he'd loved so fiercely once upon a time. Thunder crashed in the distance, but the immediate roar subsided. Silence swallowed them both again. In the near darkness, Liam felt an overwhelming sense of calm, as if all the city's ghosts had paused to see what would happen next. Then, a gust of air whooshed through the ballroom, extinguishing all remaining candles and plunging them into a void. When the lightning flashed again, Evelyn was gone, her echo lingering in the silent corridor, leaving Liam kneeling on the cold floor, uncertain whether he'd been judged or spared. By the time Liam stumbled out of the haunted hotel, dawn was breaking in the eastern sky, casting the world in pale gold. He'd half expected the building to collapse behind him or something else equally dramatic, but it stayed where it was, looming and silent. The storm had passed, leaving puddles and a damp chill in the air. Exhaustion weighed on him, physical, mental, and spiritual. But there was also a subtle shift within him, like he'd shed a layer of fear. Driving back into the city felt surreal. He saw everything through new eyes, people heading to work, the neon signs switching off, the familiar skyline. Despite the haunting events of the night, life went on around him, indifferent to his personal chaos. Yet, for the first time, he didn't feel the need to separate himself from the mundane struggles of everyday folks. He realized he was just like everyone else, flawed, vulnerable, and seeking redemption. Back at his penthouse, he felt a chill from the memories of ghosts and shadows, but something was different. The air didn't seem as menacing. He could still sense echoes of Evelyn, but they were gentler now, like a soft presence in the corner of his mind instead of a vengeful entity. Slowly, he began picking up the pieces of his life, literally and figuratively. He cleared away the mess, wiping down the windows to let in the sunlight, and collected the discarded books on curses and hauntings. Over the next few days, he found himself reaching out to people he'd wronged. Former business partners received genuine apologies. Charities got large, anonymous donations to atone for years of greed. He even visited the sidewalk where he'd thrown torn money at that woman. She was gone, of course, but he left a small envelope with another $100 bill, intact this time, and a heartfelt note addressed simply to whoever needed it. He couldn't say for certain if the curse was lifted or just lying dormant, but he felt a fragile sense of relief. Maybe he wasn't forgiven, maybe he never would be fully. But he was learning to forgive himself, little by little, and that was a start. Embracing the past, owning up to his mistakes, felt like both a burden and a blessing. Months later, Liam walked through a construction site on the edge of the city. He'd purchased the old abandoned hotel at an auction, determined to tear it down and replace it with something that might bring genuine good. A community center, affordable housing, maybe both. The ghosts that once roamed its corridors were gone, or at least quieted. Standing among the rubble, he breathed in the dust-filled air and felt a strange sense of renewal. He wasn't the same man who'd once flaunted his wealth in a pristine Rolls-Royce, oblivious to the suffering around him. He now drove a more modest car, having sold the Rolls and donated most of the proceeds to a women's shelter. The custom Armani suits were still in his closet, but he often opted for simpler clothes. His Rolex, locked away in a drawer, replaced by a watch that didn't need to scream status. And while he remained well off by most standards, he no longer lived solely for the next big deal. In a quiet ceremony, he laid the gold locket in a small box along with a letter to Evelyn, explaining his regret and his love, sealed with the vow to do better. He had the box buried in the hotel's foundation before the new construction began, a symbolic gesture of laying to rest the past. The city around him still buzzed with life, full of ambitions, heartbreaks, and second chances. But Liam felt oddly at peace, even though he knew life was messy and redemption never came easy. Sometimes he'd stand on the sidewalk where he'd first seen the mysterious woman and listen to the hum of traffic, remembering that odd moment that set everything in motion. He never saw her again, though at times he'd catch a glimpse of silver hair in a crowd and feel a fleeting pang of nostalgia. Or was it guilt? Still, he moved forward with cautious hope, forever changed by forces he couldn't fully explain. And that was okay. Not everything needed an explanation. Some truths lived in the shadows, shaping us whether we acknowledged them or not. Liam's journey had started with arrogance and ended in a kind of rebirth. Far from perfect but undeniably more human. As the new construction took shape, so did he, ready to face whatever came next with a humbled heart and a promise to himself and to Evelyn's memory. To love, to care, and never again let pride destroy what truly mattered.